we're really lucky to have my good friend, Dr. Mustafa Akyol from Washington, D.C. And he was very kind enough to accept my request to speak to our forum on a topic that's always hot in Islam, you know. I mean, extremism, rationality, reasoning, and tolerance, freedom, all these issues have always been hot uh, across the Muslim world. So therefore, and there's no better person to discuss this today because of the extensive research that he has done on these issues and the kind of lectures he has been giving and the regular articles that he has been writing in New York Times. I thought he's the best person to talk about it. I will briefly read a small bio of Mustafa Akyol. This before we start. Mustafa Akyol is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, where he focuses on the intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. A Turkish journalist and author, he worked for more than a decade as an opinion columnist for Hurriyet Daily News and the Middle East focused almonitor.com. Since 2013, he has also been a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. Akyol is the author of Islam Without Extremes, a Muslim Case for Liberty, praised by the Financial Times as a forthright and elegant Muslim defense of freedom. The book was longlisted for the 2012 Liona Gelber Prize and has been published in Turkish, Malay, and Indonesian. It was subsequently banned in Malaysia in 2017 after Akyol's short arrest by the country's religious police. We didn't know there were religious police in Malaysia too. Merely because Akyol delivered a public lecture defending religious freedom. In fact, he had attacked the idea of apostasy and the death penalty for apostasy. That got the goat of the religious police in Malaysia, and they briefly detained him in Malaysia before he was let to go. The book's banned Malay edition is now freely available on the Cato Institute's website. He's also the author of Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims, which received praise from the New York Times, and of 6 books in Turkish, including Rethinking the Kurdish Question, meaning he's written 6 books in Turkish too, including Rethinking the Kurdish Question. For the past 2 decades, Akyol's articles have appeared in a wide range of other publications such as the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, First Things, The Forward, the Weekly Standard, the Financial Times, the London Times, the Guardian, the Washington Times, and Pakistan's The Dawn. He has appeared frequently on CNN, BBC, NPR, and Al Jazeera English, and on prominent TV shows such as Fareed Zakaria's GPS and Hard Talk. His TED Talk on faith versus tradition in Islam has been watched by more than 1.2 million viewers. Before joining the Cato Institute between January 2017 and June 2018, Akyol was a senior visiting fellow at the Freedom Project at Wellesley College. He studied political science and history at Bogazici University in Istanbul. I'm sorry, I got the pronunciation wrong. Anyway, this is the short bio of Mustafa Akyol, and in fact, I have been following quite regularly. I read all his columns mostly in the New York Times, and in fact, we got in touch only after he tweeted one of my articles on blasphemy, and that's how we got in touch, and then we became good friends online. Although I haven't met him, I was supposed to meet him in Washington in April. Unfortunately, I couldn't travel because of the coronavirus issue. Perhaps maybe next year, inshallah. And Akyol, how would you like to go about it? Maybe will you speak something for about 15 minutes, and then we can have a conversation so that you can set the ball rolling?
Sure.
I mean, whichever way you prefer, we will do that.
I can use some 10 minutes for some remarks, then we can expand if you will.
Sure.
First of all, salam alaikum to everybody who's watching us, who's with us, who's participating. And thank you so much, Faisal, for organizing this. Just to add on thanks for the long bio you read. I should add that I'm Turkish, and alhamdulillah, I'm Muslim. I grew up in a Muslim society, Muslim family. Alhamdulillah, I'm proud of my faith. And I'm not a religious authority. I'm not an imam or a sheikh. I don't claim to give any fatwa on any issue. But as a Muslim myself, who's been studying the Quran, Islamic sources from my high school years, besides all the secular education I had, and also being in different Islamic communities in Turkey, different Jama'ah and all that. I mean, I've been deeply involved in Islamic thought. And I've written about this for many years in Turkey, in my home country. I moved to Washington, D.C. just 2 years ago, so this is America is a new environment for me. But I published in the U.S. media, partly to offer an understanding of Islam that is critical of both the Islamophobes and also some of the, I think, unwise Muslims or radical voices, unfortunately, we have.
Yeah.
And I think today we Muslims need to rethink a lot of important issues. And we have, of course, traditional ulama, scholars that we will respect their heritage, but we need also intellectuals, which will also understand the secular world out there better, but then who will be grounded in Islam as well, and who will try to offer some thoughts. And Turkey, by the way, has a lot of very thoughtful theologians. So when I'm writing about Islamic issues, I often rely on late Ottoman sources or the theological perspectives in Turkey that are maybe not known outside of Turkey, but I want to broaden the perspective of Muslims around the world. Now, why are we speaking about reason, tolerance, and freedom? Because, I mean, that's the subtitle of my upcoming book. I will have a book, inshallah, published by a US publisher, St. Martin's Press, in 2021, April. The title is Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance. A return, because I think those values are already in our tradition and in our sources, but overshadowed to some extent by tradition, by interpretation, by just history. So let me briefly, and probably we can speak more when the book comes out, but let me briefly highlight what I mean by these three concepts and what can they mean to us today. When I speak of reason, what I mean is that Allah gave us scripture, right? The Quran, and we have the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his Sunnah, and his tradition. We have texts, we have hadiths, and we have, of course, the Quran. Now, there are two ways of reading these texts. One is to read them and to say, this is written in this way, period. I will go and implement this as it is written in the world I'm living in, which is a literalist interpretation, which doesn't put any reason, any rational interpretation into the text. The other one is to read the text and to say, yes, probably Allah said this and Prophet Muhammad said this, and probably in a certain context there was a asbab for this, and try to understand what it means, and then bring that perspective to today with a less literalist understanding. Fazlur Rahman, who was a great scholar from the subcontinent, I think wrote a lot about this in the 70s and 80s. He was from Pakistan. He also came to the US later. Now, I'll give you just one example, which is, I think, also relevant for India's Muslims, as I've been following the news. There's a notion called triple talaq. Probably you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
In India, it was discussed, and it was recently banned by the Modi government, as I understand. Now, the notion of triple talaq, that goes back to the Quran. There's a verse which says, divorce is twice. After the second one, the third time, keep your wife or let her go with beauty, with grace. So based on this, Islamic law developed the idea that a couple can divorce only 2 times. After the third divorce, they can't go back again. They can't remarry again. So they have to go something called the hulla, which is the woman must marry another man first to go back to her original husband, which created a lot of complications in Muslim societies. I mean, because a couple can divorce 2 times. Maybe they're angry at each other, but they may make it up again. But after the third time, they can go back again. And it even got worse because some scholars said those two divorces take place when those three divorces take place when the husband just says it in one instance. I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, then it's done, right? There can be no remarriage. So this, if you blindly read the verse, you have to implement it this way. I mean, it's written in the Quran. But when you read why there is a verse like that in the Quran, when you read the history behind it, when you read the context behind it, you see something interesting. Before Islam, Arabs had the notion of idda, which is when you divorce, the woman has to wait for 3 menstruation periods so you know whether she's pregnant or not, which the Quran continued. It's a very reasonable tradition. It's a very reasonable custom, and the Quran continued. But there were some men who were abusing idda. And we know this from a hadith. Aisha, a woman came to Aisha, Prophet's wife, a woman came to Aisha and said, my husband divorces me, waits for 3 months, then says, okay, I take you back. Then we wait, then he says, okay, I divorce you again. Then after 3 months, he says, okay, I take you back. And he has done this so many times. He's been keeping me like that, not marrying, not divorcing, in hanging for years. So there was a reason. Then the verse came and said, you can divorce women only 2 times. But after the 3rd time, you can't do this again. So it was, the verse came to correct a particular practice in that society at the time. So its intention, its maqsad, maqasid, plural, was to save women from a patriarchal custom. Now, from the Fazl Rahmani perspective, you can say the divine intention, God's intention here was to protect women from men who abuse them. Then if you understand it that way, you can say in our day and age, the same commandment can be interpreted. You can say it had a certain illa, certain cause, so we can reinterpret today. But if you don't do this, you can say it is written 3 divorces and period, and we will implement it like that. And then you have cases where a triple talaq really brings disaster to a family, especially if the husband says it 3 times in one setting, and if you have an ulama. There are other examples like this. For example, there are hadiths advising against women traveling alone. Based on that, for example, Saudi Arabia recently didn't allow women to drive cars or, you know, get on a bus by herself without a male guardian, without a male from her family. When you look into the context of these commandments, you see that Prophet, peace be upon him, said this because it was a dangerous time. A woman going alone in the desert in 7th century Arabia would be attacked by bandits. She would be dishonored, everything. It was a very dangerous situation for a woman. Now, if that situation changes, and if it is not unsafe anymore, if everybody can safely get on a plane or a bus and go, and that context has changed, can we reinterpret that? Can we not implement that anymore? So these are issues of jurisprudence in Islam, and I think we need to bring more reason in understanding the intentions of that. Luckily, we have a tradition called Maqasid al-Sharia, which is the intentions of the Sharia. We owe it to some classical scholars. The most important one was Imam Shatibi from Granada. And he said all Sharia is about protecting 5 principles. The protecting religion, life, property, lineage, and the intellect. In the 20th century, Ibn Ashur, like a Tunisian scholar, added freedom, hurriya, to these maqasid. So, and when we look into the maqasid perspective, the world looks different. I mean, there's actually an Islamic team of scholars which published something called the Islamicity Index. They look into the maqasid of Sharia and they try to see in which countries these maqasid are fulfilled. The protection of life, religion, property, intellect, and lineage. Not Muslim countries are not top in that index. I mean, they are most served in New Zealand or Ireland or countries like that. So I believe we are at a time that our scholars need to look more into the maqasid of a certain injunction in the Sharia, rather than saying we have to implement it like this, because the divine intention in the first place was something different. So this is one of the things I'm discussing in my book, and I'm showing examples of how maqasid way of thinking can change our perspective on certain things. And when we don't do that, we might be doing something which is actually what the Sharia did not intend in the first place. And I think the triple talaq issues in India was one case. I also speak about freedom, hurriya, in terms of Arabic. Of course, there is a very important verse, a part of a verse in the Quran, Baqarah 256, La ikraha fi din. Probably every Muslim knows this, right? No compulsion in religion. But I was arrested in Malaysia for reading this verse. Why? Because in Malaysia, like they do in Saudi Arabia, they interpret La ikraha fi din in a more limited way. When you read translations of the Quran, Ma'al, as we'd say in Turkish, they write La ikraha fi din, they open a parenthesis and they add while entering Islam. So what's the difference between no compulsion in religion, La ikraha fi din, no compulsion, and no compulsion in religion while only entering Islam? Well, the implication is that we will not coerce you to become a Muslim, but if you have become a Muslim, you can't leave the religion, you cannot be an apostate, that's criminal. Also, in the religion, there will be a religious police forces, Hisba forces, that will check if you're praying, that will check if you are fasting, that will check if you're drinking alcohol, otherwise you will be punished for that. So the observance of religion is something that has to be coerced from the outside. Now, this coercive understanding of Islam is not in the Quran, if you ask me, but it is in our tradition. It's in the Sunni and Shia traditions. And I think those traditions reflect a certain social norm of the time. It doesn't reflect the core of Islam that we have to preserve. And I have seen throughout my life, this coercive tradition in Islam doesn't help even Islam. I've been to Saudi Arabia and several times, and every time I got a flight back to Istanbul, all women would enter the plane with hijab. When we landed in Istanbul, many of them would go out without the hijab. So you are coercing these women to practice something, and they have to do it because you're forcing them, but they're not doing it with their real intention, which means there is no religious value in that, because in Islam, practice is based on your niyat. I mean, there is no value in creating a hypocritical implementation of Islam. So by freedom, I mean this, that religion should not be coerced and Muslims should be free to practice their religion. This is also important in terms of different sects of Islam. You know, we have Sunni Muslims, we have Shia Muslims. If you coerce people to observe one notion of Islam, ultimately you impose one understanding of Islam to another one. That's why in Sunni majority countries, Shia Muslims complain from discrimination, sometimes worse. And in Iran, you know, Sunni Muslims sometimes complain from that. There are few Sunnis in Iran. Which brings me to the third notion of tolerance. And tolerance is, and I defend these concepts by going back to Islamic roots. I defend tolerance, especially by referring to the school of thought called Murjia in early Islam. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar. But the Murjia was a theological school in the first century of our faith. They influenced Abu Hanifa, so they had some influence on Hanafi school and Maturidi school as well. They were the exact opposite of the people that we call the Khawarij, the Kharijites. The Khawarij, as probably everybody would know, these were fanatics, the Al-Qaeda of the first century, as some people call them, in the sense that they condemned both Ali and Muawiyah for the fitna civil war in Islam, and they condemned all Muslims other than themselves as kafir, and they started killing a lot of Muslims. So they were judging other Muslims and in the name of God, and they were punishing them. Murjia said the exact opposite. They said, no, we don't have the authority to judge Muslims. The judgment on a Muslim's fate should be postponed to afterlife to be solved by God. And the word murjia comes from that. It comes from postponing. They said we cannot condemn Ali or Osman or Muawiyah. They're all Muslims. You know, we accept them as they are. And if they have made a mistake, it's up to Allah to judge. And they built this base on which Muslims can have different opinions about history, about political issues, about Sunni Shia divisions, but leave it up to God and not judge. That perspective had actually some good influence on Sunni Islam, but it is forgotten a little bit. So I'm going back to the Murjia perspective and saying, I'm arguing for toleration within Islam. We don't have we have the right to say our understanding of Islam is probably the best, you know, and that's why we follow it. But we can't say others are kafir or munafiq or condemn them. Similarly, we have to tolerate other religions or people who don't have a religion, atheists or other things like that, because we ultimately live in societies that are complex, and there are citizens with different points of view, so, and we need more toleration. So my book goes back to the sources, the theological and jurisprudential sources of toleration in Islam, and criticizes some of the intolerant attitudes we have seen throughout Islamic history and today. I criticize, for example, also the notion that there is a firqa-i najiyah, the saved sect. There's a hadith which says my ummah will be divided into 72 sects. I doubt the authenticity of that hadith. And it's funny that in our history, lots of sects quoted that hadith saying that 72 sects are there, only one of them is saved. Who's one of them? Of course, us. Everybody says it's us, you know. Whereas I think we should be more humble, because I think venerating your own sect is just, I think, arrogance. And of course, we have convictions, we have traditions, but we should be a bit more humble about whether they are the absolute right ones. So these are kind of ideas I get into my book. And I just threw out there, but I'll be happy to hear thoughts, questions, objections, you know, from our valuable participants here on these issues or any other issue they think is relevant to my work. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Mustafa, for this, for setting the tone for the discussion. And in fact, when you spoke about Murjia, which comes from Irja, that is to go back to Allah and wait for Allah's decision to come. I think it's also, if I'm not wrong, based on a verse in chapter 9, 106, right? I think wherein Allah asks, right? Chapter 9, 106, if I'm not wrong, the concept of Irja is mentioned. You know,
it's in the Quran. I don't remember the number, but yes, it's in the Quran. I mean, it says God will, when you go to afterlife, God will inform you about the things that you have differed.
Absolutely. So I think that's where, you know, murjauna li amrillah, murjauna li amrillah, wait for the decision of Allah. I mean, that's the whole concept there. And you know, I recall in your book, Islam Without Extremes, you also mentioned John Locke's letter on toleration, right? And then John Locke was basically attacking and opposing Catholic imperialism, you know, what you call the Catholic imperialism in the 17th century England, you know, where these
John
people...
Locke was a Christian Murjia.
He was a Christian Murjia. So you mentioned this, I remember, in your book, and you quote this letter on toleration, which was written in 1689, if I'm not wrong. And no, don't you think now we are now also dealing with what Catholics were doing, perhaps, you know, and there, you know, he has also been criticized, if you remember, that, you know, that he was not, he didn't give a blank check to the Catholic. He said, we will tolerate you only if you stop your uncivility. If you're not uncivil, we will tolerate you. Of course, that's one interpretation.
Yeah.
Of course, that apart, keeping that in, are we not coming here now, I mean, in the 21st century, from a Muslim perspective, now we are kind of dealing with clerical imperialism. if I may use the term clerical imperialism, they want to impose your views through fatwas and many other, so I mean, what do you call, edicts or verdicts or whatever you call them. Although they claim fatwa to be an opinion, but actually it's a verdict. Sometimes it's an edict. So this clerical imperialism, how do you think Muslim societies must deal with it? Where we are forced to do. Should we not kind of question this clerical imperialism like John Locke did in those days against the Catholics?
I mean, first of all, John Locke was an important figure, of course. He's known as the father of liberalism. And when today people use the term liberalism, they generally imagine it as a totally secular idea. Quite the contrary, liberalism was an interpretation of Christianity. It was a tolerant interpretation of Christianity. John Locke was a Christian, and all his arguments most of his arguments are filled with references to Bible or Christianity. And because just like in Islam, in Christianity too, you have more tolerant or more authoritarian interpretations. And in the West, luckily, the more tolerant interpretations grew over time. And that's why today many Muslims are happily living in the West. When they're persecuted in their own countries, they're going to the West, which doesn't mean that the West is superior or anything, but things got better there in the past few centuries. And it was worse. I mean, 5 centuries ago, we were much more tolerant than Europe, but things changed. To come back to your question, what are we supposed to do? Well, the ulama should understand that they can have opinions, they can have fatwas, but that is not a law to be implemented by the states. That should not be a law implemented by the states. Because if you ask a Barelvi scholar, what's the verdict on Shia, or what's the verdict on this and that, or Ahmadis, and he can have a pretty rigid answer. Well, okay, that is your opinion, but will the state authority implement that? It shouldn't, because if the state does that, it will be taking one among many interpretations of Islam and making it the law of the land.
That's correct.
No, why are you taking this one rather than that one? Well, maybe that's the majority. Maybe that's what the state prefers. But then the state is interpreting choosing one thing and imposing it on the whole population, which was not even the case in classical Islam. I mean, in the Ottoman Empire, Hanafi law was, yes, standard, but in a Shafi region, you would be following the Shafi law. There was no standard law. If you're a Christian, you would be not even subject to the Sharia. You would have your own patriarch that you would be following. The idea of a standard law came in the 19th century, one law for the whole country. And it was inevitable because you needed citizens to interact with each other more often, so you needed one thing, otherwise it would. When you read the history of the Ottoman legal reforms, you see that Ottomans had to bring one reform, one law for everybody because of all the trade, increasing trade, disputes between Muslims and Christians. But if you make that one law, the law of 30% of society, and impose it on the rest, that is unfair. You need a neutral law as far as possible. So there should be laws saying that everybody has religious freedom, everybody has the right to practice their religion, but one person calling the other one kafir cannot be the state's position. One person calling itself as a heretic cannot be the position of the state. Pakistan was founded with a good perspective I'm describing here, but unfortunately it tilted towards a more ulama oriented. And also the ulama disagree with each other too. Which one again are you taking? I mean, we should challenge we should challenge the ulama's effort to dominate the state, or the state's effort to take a certain view from the ulama and impose it on the rest. Other than that, scholars can think what they think, but then we need an open space to be discussed, to be able to discuss these issues. You think
absolutely?
You think apostates from Islam should be executed? Well, well, no. Here's the other arguments, and you should not be jailed for making that argument.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you were jailed for that. In fact, temporarily, though. Thankfully, you got out. Luckily, from there.
Yeah, I mean, thanks to some diplomacy, it was short.
Yeah.
But,
And in fact, Akyol, what is happening now, it is kind of leading to another thing, this rigidity among the, or imperialism, when I want to call it certainly imperialism, they want to impose and kind of extend their authority over others. Now it is kind of leading to, again, something what is antinomian, and kind of an antinomianism, where it is the Muslims are told you don't have to follow any other law. You're not obliged to follow or obey any other law except the law of God. And what is the law of God? It is what we say is the law of God, or what we interpret it to be. Because we know we have the Quran, we have the Quranic text, but then the text is there. But who would interpret the Quran? You don't have the authority to do that. We are the authority, the clerics, and because we have gone through this so-called 8 years or 12 years course on Islam, and you don't have that. I mean, we are to understand Islam better than you. Therefore, what we say is the correct interpretation of Islam, and that is what you need to follow. And you mentioned instant triple talaq in India. You're absolutely right. What happened was, when the Supreme Court gave a judgment, the Supreme Court of India, when they gave a I think my video is gone, perhaps. Okay, anyway, when the Supreme, you can hear me at least?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah. For some reason the video is gone. I don't know. I'll have to. Yeah.
Your video is gone. I don't see you, but I see some other parts.
It's back. I think there was some problem. Anyway.
Okay.
See, in the triple talaq case, which I want you to take it forward from here, from what I'm telling you, when the Supreme Court of India gave a decision invalidating instant triple talaq, there are several Muslim organizations in India which kind of told the Muslims, Supreme Court is not our authority, kind of. We don't accept the decision. As far as our Sharia is concerned, when a Muslim husband divorces his wife instantly, thrice, the divorce happens. So they instructed the Muslims, some Muslim organization, that you don't have to follow. But if you live as husband and wife after having pronounced such a decision, such a divorce, you would be committing adultery. So this is a kind of antinomianism coming into play here, where Muslims are told you don't have to obey any other law except what we say, what law we give you in the name of Islam or Sharia. So how do we deal with this? Is happening in many societies, where we take the case of child marriage. How do you deal with this? Yeah.
There is a view in Islam which goes back to the Ahli Hadith movement, that oppose Ahli Ray.
Ahli Ray, yeah.
Yeah, which according to this understanding, no law other than the Sharia has any legitimacy.
Yes.
This has come back in the 20th century with the writings of Sayyid Qutb in a more Islamist, political Islamist way. Actually, according to this interpretation, if you accept a law other than Islam, you become a kafir, because you take other human beings as God, because only God can legislate. Now, if you put it this way, of course, most Muslims have become kafir because they're living in countries where there are laws and they're obeying those. But the point is, I don't think that there is anything in the Quran that gives any such view. The Quran has laws, but it doesn't say you cannot obey any other laws. The Quran actually speaks of maruf, the known, earth,
bil maruf,
which is the maruf. And actually, some of the rules of the Quran are based on Arab maruf of the time. Sacred months. Arabs had that. So the Quran found that, in its context, and legislated that. Zihar was an Arab custom. The Quran banned that one. So instead of thinking that only God can legislate, we have to understand that what any law is for. Laws are made for justice. They can be bad laws. They can be good laws. So God wants justice. So we can go toward justice by, thanks to the Sharia, which has served justice in the Islamic civilization for centuries. But people in New Zealand might be establishing justice. They don't know any Sharia. But they are human beings. They have a God-given conscience. They might be establishing justice there, and that is legitimate because the ultimate point is justice. And that is why so many Muslims are, Muslims are fleeing Syria today because of the tyrant there killing so many Muslims. They want to go to Germany. They don't want to go to Saudi Arabia. They want to go to Norway because intuitively they understand that these societies there's justice there. There's economic opportunities too, and they are connected. I mean, economy thrives in a state of justice. So all law is, the objective of Sharia is justice. There might be bad interpretations of Sharia fiqh, wrong interpretations of Sharia, which do not serve justice. On the other hand, there might be a non-Muslim society which is serving justice by its own tradition, whatever that is. First of all, there are Christians who already have a monotheistic tradition, or Jews, and just even atheists, can establish a state of justice because God gave humanity not just revelation, but also reason, but also conscience, but also earth, and people, and of course, to accept this, you have to open some issues in Islam, theological issues, Asharis versus Mu'tazila and Maturidi. Can good and bad be known even without Sharia? The Mu'tazila and Maturidi said yes. Even if we didn't know any Sharia, we would know theft or murder are wrong, or helping a person in need is right. Of course, that theological perspective allows that. Whereas the Asharites said, no, only through Sharia these things are known. So if you think like that, of course, you narrow yourself. But I don't share that view, and I don't think that is Islamically sound. I don't think that explains the world we're living in. Why so many Muslim societies lack Sharia, and there are many non-Muslim societies Muslim societies that lack justice, but so many non-Muslim societies have justice, objectively speaking.
Yeah, in fact, since you mentioned reason, Mustafa, you may recall, of all people, Ibn Taymiyyah wrote a treatise called, right? The Ta'arruz al-Aql wal-Naql, where he said there is no clash between Aql and Naql. Meaning, but actually what he really meant, not that the reasoning is supreme, but he said that what we say to be that, because again, it comes back to the same thing. The revelation, the naql or the text of the Quran, we will interpret that, and this has to be reconciled with the aql. Even if your interpretation does not happen to be reasonable, you try to do some ta'wil and stretch it and try to reconcile. So the entire book, all Dar Ta'arruz al-Aql wal-Naql, which you wrote, deals with that. I'm sure you must have gone through that, right?
Yeah, actually, let me then, since you referred to Ibn Taymiyyah, which has some good ideas and bad ideas, I should say, but but he was an important figure, of course, in Islamic thought. Ibn Taymiyyah's student, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, was even better. And and there is actually a quote from him I got in my book, and it's just in front of me. If you allow me, let me read that in just two words.
Please go ahead.
So Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya wrote in the 14th century, Sharia is all about wisdom and achieving people's welfare in this life and afterlife. It is all about justice, mercy, wisdom, and good. Thus, any ruling that replaces justice with injustice, mercy with its opposite, common good with mischief, or wisdom with nonsense is a rule that does not belong to the Sharia, even if it is claimed to be so according to some interpretation. Well, this is, I think, the tragedy, explains the tragedy of the Muslim world today. There are a lot of people who say we are upholding the Sharia, but there's no justice, there's no mercy in that. And justice and mercy, these values are knowable by human reason. People understand these values when they see it. And that's why I think we have to revive these lost perspectives in Islam that you rightly referred to. I mean, and Ibn Taymiyyah was a critic of Asharites on certain levels, and I agree with him on certain things. He was quite harsh on some other issues, so it's complicated, but the thing is, Islamic tradition is rich, so and the important thing is that these scholars saw these problems 1,000 years ago, 700 years ago. In the 21st century, these problems have become much bigger.
True.
So the scholars accepted that you need ijtihad, you need maqasid, you need maslaha to reinterpret certain things, and
yes.
the change needed at that time was so small.
Yes.
Shatibi saw some limitations of Islamic law on commerce, so he realized that you have to. The change we need is because the world has changed immensely in the past 3 centuries. That's why we are talking through what a Cisco WebEx meeting from.
WebEx.
This whole change requires a new attitude in Islam, and I think a lot of Muslims think, oh, this is happening because the West is wanting this, the Zionists are asking this, and that sort of thing. Well, no, it's not. Of course, the Western powers, whatever, will be maybe happier to more liberal attitudes. Maybe won't, because sometimes they use actually harsh Islamic attitudes for their own imperialistic goals and so on and so forth. But it's not because somebody wants this, some institution in the West is asking for Muslims to change. No, if as Muslims we want to give a message to the world, that a message that will make people understand the virtue of Islam, we have to question certain things. You can't say our religion is a religion of peace, but then we execute anybody who leaves the religion. People are shocked with this, and you can say, okay, let them go to hell, but what then who are you appealing to? What does Islam say to the rest of humanity? When Islam first came, it shocked people with its moral virtue. It said, if baby girls should not be buried alive. It was a virtuous message. So anybody who was seeking moral virtue could see the blessings there. Today, some of the things we're doing or seeing in the name of Islam shock people, not because they're virtuous, but because they're not, because they are intolerant, they're violent, and so on and so forth.
In fact, in a way, before we open up the discussion for the other participants, I just want to ask you one last question, your views on that. See, you mentioned even the Mu'tazila, who were promoted by Al-Mamun, and then their ideology was there for about 15 years, that's all. I think that ideology at that time, which was very liberal and based on rationalism and rationality, unfortunately got destroyed, perhaps because it was tried again. Imposition happened, the mihna. Mamun and others tried to impose it through the mihna. A lot of people were persecuted. It was kind of an inquisition, right, where people who did not accept the Mu'tazili school of thought were attacked and sometimes even incarcerated in prisons, and perhaps even physically attacked or maybe even killed. Yes, flogged. Imam Ibn Hanbal was one of the famous victims of that. So I think had they not done that, had not tried to impose Mu'tazilism, which was a very reasonable thing. In fact, today the Muslim world is suffering only because the Asharites won at that time, thanks to Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Hanbal. And then Mutawakkil came and finished off the movement. In 848.
Here's what I can say on this.
So, I think, don't we think we need to go back to that rationalism? After all, we are living in an age of reason.
I do, and here's what I will say. Thank you for bringing that up. The Mihna was a dark period. Wrong. It was wrong, absolutely. Al-Ma'mun, which did other good things. He opened the Bayt al-Hikmah. He developed Bayt al-Hikmah. Because he imposed the Mu'tazila view of the created Quran on people like Imam Hanbal, and that was wrong. One thing though, our Sunni tradition always tells us about the Mihna, but it doesn't tell us what happened before and after that. Before that, the forerunners of Mu'tazila, the people who defended free will, the Qadarites, were oppressed by the Umayyads. And after the Mihna, soon after the Mihna, Sultan as Mutawakkil, as you said, and then later there's a Qadri creed. Then Mu'tazilism became criminal. and Ashari or Hanbali dogmas were imposed violently on Muslims.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
unfortunately, all schools were oppressing each other, unfortunately. So when they had the power, so that's a mistake of all of them. That's why on the issue of, that's why I value Murjia there, like as a tolerance framework. But in terms of content of their philosophy, I think besides the mihna, besides their oppression and everything, which others did to Mu'tazila later, I think Mu'tazila was right on a few things. That is one, husn kubuh, the issue of good and bad. Like good and bad are knowable also by reason, not just by revelation.
Yes.
I think they were right on that. I think they were right on the notion of the created Quran. The Quran is God's words, but not something that pre-existed before time. I don't think that's. Otherwise, all these human words in the Quran, I mean, God would be predetermining what the Quraysh would say, you know, in 7th century Arabia. And so it helps us understand a more contextual Quran. Also, their emphasis on divine justice as being more important than divine power. You know, justice as the most important feature of God. So God wouldn't do anything that is unjust, and our sense of justice helps understand God's intentions. So I think the Mu'tazila had important perspectives, which partly survived in the Maturidi theology in mainstream Sunni Islam. So I think there's a lot to revisit and revive there. But I don't define myself as dogmatically a Mu'tazila or this or that. I mean, I think Islamic tradition is rich. We can benefit from all the interesting views there today. We should criticize Mu'tazila regarding the mihna, but we can also say, well, on certain issues they had better perspectives than the Ash'arites.
Absolutely. In fact, the Umayyads used the Khadriya versus Jabariya dispute, you know, to actually kind of promote the notion that their own caliphate was divinely ordained. That is why they, again, as you rightly said, it all boils down to political power. By hook or by crook, they want to maintain that, they want to hold on to that power. So ultimately, it all boils down to that, and Islam just came to repel those ideas. And unfortunately, they use Islam to reinforce those ideas. So that's that's an ongoing fight. It's an ongoing struggle against them, right?
Very right points. Actually, we Muslims need to see that much of our tradition was shaped by political power and for the interest of. I mean, the whole idea that apostates should be killed. Now, my conviction is that it came because Umayyads wanted to kill their critics.
Yes.
Those hadiths, whoever leaves his religion, kill him. Those hadiths do not appear for at least a century after the Prophet Muhammad. You don't see those hadiths being quoted during the Ridda wars. Caliph Umar and Caliph Abu Bakr and Umar have different views on those. You don't see those hadiths quoted at the time. Those hadiths appear a century later when the Umayyads are killing their critics, like the freedom defenders. So I think
fabricated,
I think they're fabricated. I mean, we can't know for sure, but I think that's my conviction now. I have actually a short section about that in my upcoming book. So I think we should understand that we have our tradition, which has a divine root, but then that root grew in a human context. That context had some good and bad elements. It had some political power interference in it. And also maybe it was good for its time, but the world has changed and we have to keep interpreting it.
Wonderful. I think now we should open up the discussion to the other participants. They have been waiting patiently for a long time, and I only hope they were not bored with my questions. I hope my questions were of some use, and the answers were absolutely wonderful, very educative. Thanks a lot, Mustafa, for that. And maybe if anybody wants to question, they can ask.